Good afternoon. On behalf of Engineers Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our Thought Leader series, Skills Shortages Challenging the Infrastructure Boom. My name is Megan Purdy and I'm from Engineers Australia. Firstly, in keeping with our tradition, Engineers Australia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to their cultures and to elders, past, present and emerging. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that today's webinar is being hosted with Engineers Australia's industry partner, Queensland University of Technology. QUT is a major Australian university with a global reputation and a real-world focus. Its courses equip the students and graduates with the skills they need for the world of today and tomorrow. They're an ambitious institution with a rapidly growing research output focused on technology and innovation. The Times Higher Education 2020 ranked QUT in the top 180 universities in the world and the best young university in Australia. Their strategic plan, Blueprint 6, establishes QUT as a university for the real world and charts its provisions of transformative education and research that is relevant to our communities. With approximately 50,000 students, QUT places a premium on the national and international accreditation of all professional degrees. They offer academic programs in fields spanning business, creative industries, education, engineering, health, law, science and social justice across 5 faculties. Well known for their strong links to industry and government, the high impact of their research, which involves multidisciplinary teams, can be seen across areas as diverse as climate change mitigation, digital media, materials science, and biomedical innovation. I would now like to welcome Nick Fleming, National President and Chair of the Board at Engineers Australia. Nick brings 30 years professional experience working with the private and public sectors. He has worked across infrastructure, natural resources, water, mining, energy, defence, social welfare and education sectors in Australia and abroad. During this time, Nick has held local, international and industry leadership roles and received almost 20 awards for technical excellence, leadership and innovation. In particular, Nick brings a proven capability for strategy, innovation, complex problem solving and leadership of change. He has a strong social ethos and commitment to excellence and positive impact. Nick does have an honours degree in civil and environmental engineering and a doctorate in sustainable infrastructure systems from the University of Adelaide, training in strategic foresight from Mount Eliza Business School and an international corporate governance qualification from the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Prior to establishing his own advisory firm, Nick was the Director of Business Innovation at Jacobs Group. He previously held global roles at SKM, including Chief Sustainability Officer and Technology and Innovation Manager, also sitting on board committees leading strategy and corporate social responsibility. Within industry, Nick contributed as a Director of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia and Chair of the Sustainability Task Force for Infrastructure Partnerships Australia. Nick is also a non-executive director of South Gippsland Water, an advisory board member with Infrastructure CoLab, and a faculty member of the ANZ School of Government. Please join me in welcoming Nick Fleming.
Thank you, Megan, and welcome again to our viewers. Well, it's a good time for engineers, particularly those exposed to the infrastructure boom. And as a professional, it's great to enjoy demand for your skills and the career and financial benefits that brings. Of course, many of us will have experienced these boom conditions before. I'd have, and we know the downsides. It's through this lens I'd like to share another perspective on the infrastructure sector skills challenge. Even before the pandemic, construction activity was strong, but economic productivity was weak and prosperity unevenly distributed. Stimulus spending is now magnifying this situation, as are border restrictions, capacity constraints, and cross-sector competition for engineering talent. And the frenetic environment this creates causes our focus to be narrow and short-term. In general, we look to technology and competition to gain the winning edge. But I think this is a fool's errand. Insofar as access to finance and technology is not a real constraint to progress, even with the escalation in public debt. Technology won't address the root causes of our most persistent and costly infrastructure issues. I believe we have to step back and, as an infrastructure community, ask ourselves, are we delivering future-fit, resilient assets that provide enduring value? Consider the potential for our businesses and communities to encounter explosive bushfires, a pandemic, and a cyber attack at the same time. It could trigger cascading failures of interconnected infrastructure. 5 years ago, this would have seemed fanciful, but not today. In this context, the way we are discerning and allocating risk appears to be narrow, short-sighted, and counterproductive. In so many ways, we really are missing the main game. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand that it's easy for leaders to become overwhelmed by the pace and complexity of our operating environment. As a director of a public water utility responsible for maintaining essential services, I often feel like we're trying to rebuild a plane while flying it. But today, in the face of uncertainty, leaders can't be passive and reactive. The job of leaders is to create our way forward. And it's something that I believe the infrastructure community must do better. Too often, our conversations come from a passive place of being project takers, not project makers. As project takers, we've allowed engineering to become commoditised. Engineering design is viewed as a lower order, rule-based, and thus increasingly automatable task. But engineering can and should involve clever design and delivery of high-value assets, assets that people love and want to pay for. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to be clear about the outcomes we need to achieve for our people, our businesses, and our communities, and the mindsets and skills we need from the shop floor to the top floor to make this a reality. We must also look at the work environment we provide our people, ensuring that it's both physically and mentally safe. While there are inspiring examples of this occurring, I still hear too many reports of people no longer wishing to work in the construction sector because it's become too combative and unreasonably demanding. We have very high expectations of our engineering graduates and the skills they need to be ready for the future of work. It's in time that we impose similarly high expectations on the public and private sector leaders in the infrastructure sectors and honestly ask ourselves what skills and disposition we need to lead our organisations and community forward. We are an incredibly talented nation with a world of opportunities if together we start addressing the real problems that matter in an outcome-focused and collaborative way. If we don't, we'll be having this very same conversation in a few years' time, and we will have squandered vast opportunities. Let's do better together. And so with those thoughts, I'd now like to welcome our moderator for this afternoon, Professor Stephen Kazewski. Stephen is the Acting Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Engineering at the Queensland University of Technology. And for the 17 years prior, he held the role of Head of School for the School of Civil Engineering and Built Environment and its various predecessors. He is also the Director of the QUT Project Management Academy, which delivers international executive education programs and research in the field of project management. Professor Kazewski holds undergraduate qualifications in civil engineering, postgrad qualifications in project management, and a PhD in structural engineering. He's taught at QUT and to national and international clients in the areas of project management, project control, and commercial construction management across a range of industrial sectors, including construction, civil infrastructure, mining and minerals processing, and oil and gas. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome again to our viewers. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where we're meeting today. I'd like to welcome our first speaker for today, Marion Terrell. Marion is a leading transport and cities expert with a long history in public policy. She has worked on tax policy for the Federal Treasury and led the design and development of the MyGov account. She has provided expert analysis and advice on labour market policy for the federal government, the Business Council of Australia, and at the Australian National University. Marion joined Grattan Institute in 2015 to establish the Transport Program, which she expanded to include cities in 2016. At Grattan, Marion has published on a wide variety of topics, including investment in transport infrastructure, cost overruns, value capture, traffic congestion, discount rates, and the ways the COVID crisis is changing Australian cities. Please welcome Marion Terrell.
So thank you very much for that introduction, and hi everyone, it's fantastic to be here with you today. So what I'm going to do today is to set the scene for the discussion on skills shortages in engineering construction in the context of the infrastructure boom. I'm going to draw for this short presentation on two reports that I've published during the past year in my mega project series. By way of background, I'm from the Grattan Institute, as Stephen said. That's a public policy think tank. The work we do at Grattan is independent, rigorous and practical. So we aim to influence public policy in the interests of the community as a whole. And that's how I'm going to approach today's question of skills shortages challenging the infrastructure boom. In a nutshell, what I'm going to show you today is that the way that governments are building infrastructure today definitely does put us at risk of skills shortages. And by showing you the bigger picture, I'll show you the extent and magnitude of that, and also how recent it is. So here's an overview of my argument today. I'm going to start by talking to you about the first issue, that we're building infrastructure like there's no tomorrow. So this slide here shows you the value of work under construction at each quarter since 2001. There's two things about this that I find really interesting. First of all, just the growth in the value of transport work under construction in the past 10 years, and especially over the past 5 years. We've got to the point now where the value of work currently under construction reached $125 billion worth for the first time ever in March last year. So that's one thing I think that's striking about this graph. But the second thing is that where is all the growth? It's in the really big projects. It's in the projects valued at $5 billion or more. So we now, if you look at the graph, you can see 2/3 of the value of the work under construction is in these mega projects. So what's going on, the analysis that underpins this chart, just to explain the context, is all public road and rail projects valued at $20 million or more over the past 20 years. It's very comprehensive. What this means is, in terms of the growth in the quantum and in the size of projects, the other thing you can look at is the average project. And that's what this chart is showing you. During the past 5 years, the value of an average road or rail project being built more than doubled. So it went from 430 million to 1.1 billion in 5 years. So that's what's happening right now. There's another way to look at that, and that is completed projects. What is the status of completed projects? And my next chart will show you that. What you can see here is that the 5-year average completed project size is actually pretty steady. So the huge jump up that I showed you before is really recent. It's just since 2009. This is a very new phenomenon that we're seeing. So we're entering this era of mega projects. And this next slide will show you that projects costing $5 billion or more were pretty much unheard of 10 years ago. We had our first one, in fact, 10 years ago. But now there are 9 of these under construction. It's the new normal. And don't expect any slowing down. I guess the other thing is just kind of thinking about how governments are responding. I've made a chart here from the Commonwealth budget, which was just in May. And just to explain what you're seeing here is I've gone back all the budgets back in history, and each budget has a transport spend for the budget year and the following 3 years, the forward estimates period. And they do jump around a bit, the pattern of how they do it. But what you can see is that typically we're around the 0.4% of GDP was the spend by the Commonwealth on transport projects. But when you get to last year, we had the budget delayed, if you remember, because of COVID. It happened in October, and it was quite a step higher, more around 0.6% of GDP. And that's what we've seen in May's budget. Again, a higher spend, more around 0.6% of GDP. Now, of course, the Commonwealth is not the only funder of transport infrastructure, but generally projects are co-funded with state governments. But I think I'm just showing this one chart in the interest of brevity, but this is illustrative of a pattern that there has been this step up, partly in response to COVID and the notion of stimulus, but it just shows you, I guess, how governments have been treating transport infrastructure just in the period since COVID has arrived. So all in all, what this is showing you is that the world of transport projects has changed. So what does that mean? Well, one implication is that these bigger projects that I've showed you create a competition challenge. So what's going on here is as the size of projects has grown, so has the size of contracts. So the average mega project, the average project of $1 billion or more is typically divided into 2 or 3 contracts. Whereas once you get to the average mega project, the $5 billion projects, they're divided into 4 or 5 contracts. And what that's telling you is that there aren't just more contracts on a mega project, but the average size of them is bigger. And the slide I've got here now shows you it's difficult to do this year by year because infrastructure is lumpy, but I've taken the last 7 years and the 7 years before that. And what you can see here is that in the last 7 years, the average mega project contract was a lot higher. So we're only looking at mega projects here, projects of $1 billion or more. So in fact, the average mega project was 38% higher in the last 7 years than the 7 years before that. But you can just see here, in the earlier period, there was only one $3 billion contract worth over $3 billion. And now there's quite a few of them. So the contracts themselves are very, very large. And the implication of this, of course, is that there's a shortage of competition among firms that are willing and able to take on such gigantic contracts, even in partnership with other firms. So this slide shows you a little bit about that. I'll explain what's going on with this slide. You can see that there's in the left-hand side here are the smaller contracts, and they get larger. And there's plenty there are quite a lot of the smaller, they're not necessarily small, 0 to $500 million, but there's those contracts are taken on by different types of firms. But not surprisingly, once you get to the bigger contracts, it does tail off very quickly. And so there's not as many contracts, but also, of course, they need Tier 1 firms involved, and often just Tier 1 firms involved in those contracts. And so why do we care about this? Well, it's really particularly important that Australia, therefore, be open to international firms entering our market. And that's because there's only 3 Tier 1 firms, and yet there's this growth in that part of the market. So fortunately, Australia does seem to have been reasonably open to international entrants. People have sort of pointed to the difficulties of international firms that have been established overseas entering this market. But in our research, what we found is that quite a lot of firms had entered and won work. However, there's probably room for improvement in terms of government not giving undue weight to local experience. So competition is one implication of what's happening with projects and contract sizes becoming so big. But I want to turn now to the question of capacity constraints. So if you thought that COVID had slowed engineering construction down, you would be very much mistaken. In fact, the large pipeline of work seems to be quite unaffected by the pandemic. And I'll show you a slide that illustrates that. So this slide is showing you, this is a little different to the one I showed you at the start because it's the work completed each quarter. And what you can see is that the work completed in the period since COVID is basically indistinguishable from the amount of work completed in the period immediately before COVID struck. So there was a bulging pipeline of work before COVID, and then governments pumped more in. So putting more work into an already overheated or a heated market, of course, just pushes up prices. And this slide shows you sort of how is a way to think about how important that insight is. This slide shows you what happened in Australia as the mining investment boom tailed off between 2013 and 2016. That's the grey shaded panel. What happened at that time was that labour and other inputs that had been occupied with the mining investment boom instead were used in some degree for road and rail construction. And so the flattening of prices can be seen here. And then, of course, they took off again, which is where we are now. So timing is very important, and that's the importance of what's happened with this market, where you had we already had a boom going on, and then with COVID, this notion that we need to do even more engineering construction work. And finally, what about employment? Because that's really where today's discussion is going to go. So to quote a famous urban economist, Ed Glazer, he said, "Big infrastructure requires fancy equipment and skilled engineers who aren't likely to be unemployed." And here you can see the number of people working in engineering construction. So this had already surged by 50% in the 3 years to 2020. So in the period immediately before COVID, there'd been this surge in employment in engineering construction. And then we closed the borders. So to sum up, if you think there are skills shortages, you will probably be right. You can see it really is a skills market, if you like. In other words, if you are a skilled engineer looking for new great work opportunities, this is a good time for you. Not so great if you're trying to hire one. So in conclusion, I think in Australia at least, and also in many other parts of the world, the rise of mega projects is a bit of a walk into uncharted territory. It is uncharted, but it doesn't mean we know nothing. There's certainly some systematic patterns that we can observe and that can help governments make better decisions about choosing and delivering projects. And one of those lessons is that timing really matters. And right now, times are really booming. So I hope that this forms a useful backdrop to our discussion about skills shortages in the infrastructure boom. And I look forward to the insights of my fellow panellists. Thank you.
Many thanks for your insights, Marion. I'd like to welcome our second speaker for the afternoon, Andrew Chapman. Andrew is a civil engineer with a wide diversity of experience covering the entire project life cycle from planning through design and construction and into operations and maintenance. Andrew has worked within key client organisations as well as for major contractors and with engineering organisations such as Transfield Services and GHD. Andrew was also a former president of Engineers Australia. As the CEO of the Queensland Major Contractors Association, Andrew leads the organisation representing the engineering and construction companies that are responsible for approximately 70 to 80% of the construction and civil engineering work in the state. The construction industry is one of the state's largest employers, employing nearly 250,000 people, and our world-leading contractors export technical excellence around the globe. Construction is an important industry in the economic recovery plan for Queensland, and Andrew leads the organisation in promoting the industry and advocating for a sustainable, safe and efficient industry that supports Queensland's growth. Please welcome Andrew Chapman.
Thanks, Stephen. And thank you, Marion, for some really interesting insights before. I thought I'd take the opportunity to build a little bit more on that. I think many people will have seen these kind of graphs before. These are produced by BIS Shrapnel and really do show the infrastructure outlook. You can see that we've had a bit of a wave up until 2018 with a lot of work predominantly in Victoria and New South Wales. But going forward, we move to a lot more work coming out of Queensland, even more work in Victoria and New South Wales. And this is predominantly the transport infrastructure outlook. When you then break it down and look at roads, we've got quite a peak coming forward, well up over the 10 billion a year in terms of road infrastructure spending post 2022, 23 and into 2025. And then when you look at rail, we've got a significant spend there as well. So that all adds up to say that, we've got a lot of infrastructure that is to be built over the next 5 years. In Queensland itself, each year we do a major projects and pipeline report, and you can see where we are at the moment in terms of those projects in delivery and procurement. And we're talking, in excess of 7-8 billion a year across the various sectors. Then you start talking about what is coming forward. And we're talking works in excess peaking out at about 16, 17 billion a year of work. Now, a lot of that is in transport. There's a bit in resources as well. Then you start thinking about the Olympics-related infrastructure. That's going to start coming into play from 2023, 2024 for about 6 to 8 years, so that we've got that infrastructure in place by the time the Olympics come around. You also add into it that the other states are doing significant investment at the same time. You can start to understand the resource challenge that we have. In the country, there's over 1 million. So at the moment, we've got about 1 million people employed across all building and construction. Now, this includes residential and non-residential and infrastructure construction in the country. So we're currently just making do at the levels we are at the moment, yet we're going to see a 15 to 20% increase in demand for that resource over the next 5 to 10 years. Then when you sort of look at this from a Queensland context, and all the other states are the same in terms of this, we're going to double the demand for major project labour requirements between now and 2024. That's 3 years. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of resources that are needed to deliver. And then, as I said before, when you start to look at the Olympic side of it, that adds in significant additional requirements in that gap from 2024 onwards. So that leads to some of these major resourcing issues. And there's some interesting comments here. Different states are all competing for the same resource. So, for instance, in Queensland, the public spend over the next 4 years is 54 billion. In New South Wales, that's 85 billion. And in Victoria, it's 90 billion. 5 years ago, it was half that number. So we are, as we've seen from the graphs and seen from Marion's presentation, we are moving into a very different state of industry activity. Each year we've had about 10,000 engineering graduates and about another 16,000 overseas engineers either migrate or move here to work in Australia. Now, the borders have been shut for a while. They're probably going to be shut for another little while. How long until we're able to make up that gap from the previous years with skilled resources to be able to deliver this work? And that's where our big challenge is. It's in that skilled resource, project managers, engineers who can deliver this kind of work. And it's not just the infrastructure sector that is going through significant growth. Defence there's a lot of investment into defence. We're looking at creating our own missile systems within the country. That will require a lot of resource. We're seeing a lot more onshoring of our other industries, particularly manufacturing, because COVID has brought a refocus on onshoring of that key manufacturing capability. So that is going to draw resource as well over the same period of time. So it's not just the massive infrastructure spend that we have. We've got other industries competing for the same kind of skilled, capable labour. The other thing is, how do we skill and train the construction workers of the future? That probably gets on to a few interesting opportunities for the industry going forward, particularly with respect to how we use labour. And I remember years ago when I was working, one of my bosses said to me, you got to start thinking about working smarter, not harder. And when we've got a finite amount of resource, particularly labour resource, we've got to look at how we do things smarter as an industry. And this is starting from the lowest common denominator, or the easiest thing to do to be able to move up. Streamlining the project development process. We spend across the country an inordinate amount of time, money and effort in duplicating resource on projects, particularly through the project development phase, the approvals, and then finally into delivery. Some of these projects can take up to 10 years to deliver, to get going. And we've got to look at how we can streamline that. Why do we need 3 different business cases on some projects? We've got to look at how we use our resources better to get the outcome at the end, which is a delivered product. One of the other big areas of cost and duplication of effort is in work breakdown structures. There's a massive duplication of resources and effort between engineering and construction in the work breakdown structure area. So we've got to look at a more common approach in that area, and then linking that with BIM and digital engineering tools. Integrating those models can mean greater productivity and efficiency. Use of different materials and technology can offset the need in some areas from having huge amounts of labour doing projects or doing elements on projects. Modularisation in the building sector is another great opportunity to be able to reduce that level of on-site labour that we often see. And then we start moving into the artificial intelligence and machine learning. We're already seeing many companies starting to use that AI technology, particularly around cost estimation, program development, those kind of areas, so that we can then deploy engineers to the delivery side. And then we move into automation on construction sites. Now, that may be a step too far here today, but it certainly is one that is around. When I was at TEAS, we were looking at and had started to roll out automation on a series of mine sites. With the digital technology and the BIM models and the digital engineering tools that we have, we could start to look at how we use automation, particularly on some of the greenfield projects with earthworks and heavy machinery. And what it does do, it has the added benefit of reducing the interaction between people and heavy equipment. So we're getting safer sites as well. But these are some of the opportunities challenges that we need to address, particularly with our resource challenge going forward. Thanks for the opportunity today, and I look forward to the discussion with my panellists.
Thank you, Andrew, for your insights. I'd like to open up now to our panel discussion, and joining the panel is Dennis Walsh. Dennis is the Chief Engineer from the Department of Transport and Main Roads. In this role, Dennis oversees a wide range of technologies, including geospatial technologies, road design and hydraulics, pavement materials and geotechnical engineering, traffic engineering technology and systems, structures, and safer road infrastructure. Dennis is a chartered professional engineer, a member of Engineers Australia, and a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. He has worked across a wide range of areas, including strategic planning, traffic and transport planning, road safety policy and engineering, road design, road operations, and intelligent transport systems. He has contributed to a range of national groups and is the Queensland Director on the ANCAP board. He is a board member and Vice President of ITS Australia. He is also a member of the Institute of Public Works Engineers Australia. Dennis is committed to bringing together the skills and knowledge of his team and their partners to embrace new technologies, engage with customers, and drive new ideas into action for the benefit of the community. Also joining our panel is Genevieve de Michel, Director at Gluco Transport. Genevieve is a civil and construction engineer specialising in transport and infrastructure advisory for government and private clients. She is currently working with Transport and Main Roads Strategic Rail Team as the Sector 1 North Lead, managing strategic and pre-construction planning for all rail projects north of Bowen Hills on the City Trains network. She has a background in client-side commercial and delivery management of major projects and has been involved in the pre-construction planning, procurement and delivery of some of Brisbane's most recent major projects, including Legacy Way Tunnel, Kingsford Smith Drive Upgrade and Cross River Rail. Genevieve is passionate about future-proofing the construction industry, improving the mental health of construction personnel, and also looking for ways to improve the industry to ensure its sustainability in an age of rapid change and increasing external pressures. Please welcome Dennis and Genevieve to our panel. Our speakers will now come together to take live questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so via the chat box. Please ensure that you provide your name and who the question is for. We did receive some questions on registration, and we will work through some of these over the next few minutes. Can I start perhaps with a question to the panel broadly? And just test the premise of this particular presentation, that there is indeed a skills shortage. I wonder if you might each outline for us how you see that skills shortage currently manifesting. What impacts are you currently noticing in the industry that we may not have seen 5 or 10 years ago? Dennis, maybe if I can throw to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I suppose it's interesting because in some respects, I think we haven't quite seen the impacts of the skills shortages yet. Certainly from our perspective, we've had a record program to deliver through QTRIP, which is our transport and road infrastructure program. And we've been delivering that above the target for the year for the last 3 years. So certainly industries stepped up and helped us and assisted us in delivering that. So I suppose you've got to really look at other factors and other considerations when you think about where are the skill gaps emerging. And I think from our experience, it's probably in some of those highly specialised areas which are high in demand, and we've probably not had that flow through in terms of developing people into those areas. So areas like our structural engineering area has got a very high demand on it. It's difficult to get access to the required skills at times. And another area that we're experiencing some skill shortages in are in our geotech area as well. So I think you've got to look forward as to the impacts of these record spends that we saw from presenters and anticipate what are those areas that might be problems for us, and then start to respond and encourage people into those areas where we're already seeing some early signs of skills shortage. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Genevieve, can we get your thoughts on where you're seeing impacts at the moment?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be here with my fellow panellists. So for me personally, as Dennis said, I work in a fairly specialised area at the moment, which is rail, and I'm definitely seeing a skills shortage for professionals in the rail industry. We're seeing the same teams kind of on multiple projects representing their consultancies or their engineering firms spread quite thinly across multiple major projects at the moment. And I think that's reflective also of the fact, like Marion said, these major and mega projects are fairly new to our industry. Traditionally, Queensland hasn't had a rolling rail program of major projects. So this is, again, new skills that we're calling upon in the rail industry. So I'm definitely noticing a skills shortage there. Also, because I do a lot of work with universities, I have a lot of people reach out to me looking for graduates and looking for people with 1 to 5 years experience that I could recommend to them. And that bucket is quite low at the moment. I don't have a lot to draw on there. We're seeing, I know COVID in particular has impacted undergraduates' abilities to do work experience, because a lot of companies cut work experience from their programs when budgets were very uncertain during COVID. And as a result, that's impacted the amount of engineers that are graduating from courses across Queensland that I can draw from. So definitely noticing shortages there as well.
Thanks, Genevieve. Andrew, what impacts are your members telling you that they're currently experiencing?
Thanks, Stephen, and good segue, Genevieve and Dennis. All our members are already saying that they're struggling to be able to get, 5 to 15 year experienced project managers and senior project engineers. That's probably where the greatest challenge is at the moment. They're all running around saying, have you got, we're after this kind of person, we're after these kind of people. They are really struggling already. It will only be exacerbated further. I think one of the good things for the industry over the last probably 12 months has been that with the border closures, we had a steady stream of engineers going down to Sydney, going down to Melbourne from Queensland for the past 5 odd years. With the border closures, that has meant that a lot more engineers are remaining here. And so they've been able to get refocused, but going forward, we're going to see a lot more challenge in that senior project engineer and project manager area.
Thanks, Andrew. Marion, if I could just divert a little bit now. You used a term during your presentation that that building infrastructure like there's no tomorrow. Are you noticing state-based trends? Are you seeing that interstate migration heating up as a result of international border closures? Are there particular state peculiarities that we might feel in Queensland that other states aren't feeling?
I think it is interesting. So Andrew talked a bit about this in his presentation, and what I am finding in the data is that, as you would expect, the bigger states are doing a lot more. But one observation is that South Australia has its first mega project, the North-South Corridor, coming on, and so this is the impetus to have the big projects we're seeing across the board. And I think there is quite a lot of restriction on movement of labour, not only for international borders, but interstate borders seems to be an effect as well. So one of the reflections I've got about the way that these skills shortages can play out is to reflect back on the mining investment boom and the mining boom more generally, because a lot of people in Australia relocated for the mining boom. And so we might have thought there were skills shortages, but what we found is people moved out of other industries. And the reason that they were willing to do so is because the pay was good. And that's a thing to think about with these sort of with skill shortages, that skill shortages at particular price rates, it doesn't mean that they're absolutely rigid skill shortages. And the other point that Andrew also made, which I thought was very interesting, is that there's these options to substitute smart technology for people. So things like modularization and artificial intelligence and machine learning and all of these kinds of things. And what they do is they change the skills mix as well as the quantity of skills that are demanded for a particular job. So it's a very fluid picture. It's not simply the closing of national borders that is affecting the quantity of skills or the number of skilled workers or the number of workers with particular skill sets. It's also how we go about doing these projects and how that can change over time.
Thank you. Marion, Andrew, you both mentioned Olympics 2032. Is this just going to be another lump in the mega project pipeline, or is this going to have a particular impact on these skill shortages that we're currently expecting?
Would you like me to take that one first?
Let's go first. Thanks,
You're
Andrew.
the local, Andrew.
I'll put my foot in it. I think, look, it's too early to be able to say what is actually on the program for the Olympics, because there's a body of work being done at the moment, or has been done, that's being verified at the moment between the federal and the state government as to what is going to be on the list. But what we do hope is on the list, and what has been spoken about, is it being legacy infrastructure. It's not just infrastructure for the Games, it's infrastructure for South East Queensland and Queensland for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Now, you would imagine that there's a lot in the public transport and transport space to happen. I would say some of that will be major projects, potentially some new rail line upgrades. Some of it will be mid-scale type projects, level crossing removals, open level crossing loop changes, those kind of infrastructure investments. And then there's probably some water and energy infrastructure as well required. So I think it will actually be a mix of the major projects and some of the what we would call business as usual or larger business as usual type projects within predominantly South East Queensland. That will certainly fill the gap from 24 onwards, but it depends. It remains to be seen how big that infrastructure investment is. We're hearing numbers of 10 billion, 12 billion. That will certainly add to the general infrastructure that's required to be done in terms of renewing, particularly transport assets, over that period of time. So it will create another boom, whether it is a boom on top of a boom or holds a steady level for in terms of investment for a decade is yet to be seen.
So I think, I guess my comment about the Olympics would be that it's a very risky business to take on the Olympics. So the typical cost overrun is 172%, according to a study of all the Olympics since 1960. And the legacy infrastructure can come at a very high cost. So my plan is to do some research on this in 2022 and to try to come up with recommendations to get the best out of it and minimise the risks, particularly of cost overruns and of white elephant infrastructure being the legacy. So to make sure that what comes out of it actually is of value to the community of South East Queensland.
Thanks, both. Dennis, I'd appreciate your thoughts on that as well. Your role's going to put you a little bit in the hot seat, I suppose, with transport and infrastructure projects leading up to the Games. How is the organisation gearing up towards that, or is this just run-of-the-mill and we're going to handle it like we normally do?
Thanks, Stephen. I don't think it'll be run-of-the-mill, so to speak. But look, the organisation has been already looking at working with other agencies and with the federal government around planning for the event. And so there'll be a lot of modelling, a lot of lessons we learnt through hosting the Commonwealth Games can come to bear here as well. I think one of the things that sort of possibly distinguishes this from previous Olympics is that change by the International Olympic Committee around looking to host countries and cities to really try and utilise the infrastructure they already have in place, and to have an eye to that legacy issue and not having those white elephant sort of projects that Marion mentioned. So I think that's very much been the backdrop to Brisbane's bid here and the broader Queensland, South East Queensland bid. We've already got a mega project underway with Cross River Rail, and that wasn't insignificant, I suppose, in terms of signalling to the Olympic Committee that we already had, plans afoot that we're building for the future. And for events like the Olympics, that'll come in extremely handy. The other thing that obviously comes into consideration is that sort of trip arrangements, the origin destinations that people are undertaking. So the destinations, being the venues, are being selected to try and capitalise on where our infrastructure is. And in addition to that, I think the other thing to remember here in this space is that, the Olympics are looking for a carbon neutral outcome here, and transport is going to be a significant component of that. And so sustainable transport will be really important. So we're really looking at a multimodal solution. The department's vision is a single integrated transport system accessible to everybody. And so this really gives us an opportunity to realise that vision for that event, but for it to be there long term for the community beyond the Olympics. So I think we've been doing a lot of early planning. That'll continue. But like Andrew said, I suppose it's yet to be seen how that manifests itself in terms of the overall spend in the program.
Thanks, Dennis. Genevieve, let's dig in a little bit further then around solutions. And one of the questions that we received as folk registered, the skills shortage, is it a government issue? Is it an industry issue? Whose job is it to solve the problem?
That's a big one. Thanks, Stephen. I think everybody needs to take some responsibility here for the problem that we've got affront. I think from an industry point of view, they are trying their hardest, but I think given the volume of infrastructure that we've spoken about today, there's a little bit of a reactive response that I've seen recently where, like Andrew mentioned earlier, I think they can see a need for 5 to 10 year professionals that is looking like it's not going to be serviced in the near future. And there's that sporadic asking everybody to look out for those types of people. I think we need to start much earlier than that. So I think it's up to the government and industry to be engaging at an educational level. We know that parents and guardians are still responsible for guiding children's and young professionals' career choices. So I think we need to start educating at that level as well to try and increase the pipeline from the ground up. If we look to something like the Olympics, these are still high school students that might be 5-year professionals when the Olympics is being delivered. So we need to actually look at this as a pipeline instead of just looking at an immediate fire that we need to put out now, I think. Government can help. As Marion said, there's obviously these giant peaks that we're seeing in our infrastructure program, and we can look at timing around those. Unfortunately, events that have a deadline on them might drive those peaks to remain. But I think government are responsible for looking at how they can best support industry to resource projects effectively in their procurement documents and their contract structures, like Marion was talking about earlier as well. So I think government definitely plays a role, and then I think industry play a very important role in connecting back into those educational institutions to try and provide some feedback around the skills that they're requiring so that we can be prepared as educators to support the industry and their needs in the upcoming decade.
Do you think, Genevieve, that there's more that universities and let's face it, technical colleges as well, for the blue-collar workers to our sector, is there more that we should be doing to help fill the skills gap? How can we engage more with industry and industry with us?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Stephen. I think creating opportunities for industry to come to campus, but also for university to go out to industry and actually ask for that feedback is really important. I know that, for example, QUT runs some very good course advisory boards where they have industry professionals sitting on those boards that provide advice to the academics around what they would like to see in the coursework, so that they're being assured that what they're requiring in industry is actually being picked up in the education and the syllabus. I think we just need to put more emphasis on that important two-way communication. So industry know that they can lean back on universities as a support network and vice versa. So industry also should engage early, and things like undergraduate employment and undergraduate training is really important for our industry. It's too late to wait till students are at a graduate level to employ them. You really need to be teaching them on the job, and that's where they learn a lot of those really valuable skills, and also cultural alignment that helps them feel personally aligned with the industry long term, and then we find that they stay longer as well.
Okay. Perhaps first to you, Dennis, and then you, Andrew. How can large organisations, be they government or private, strive to meet the skills requirements for projects? What are you seeing that's working currently in the industry?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Look, I think we very much work closely with industry, so the relationship between government, and I know Transport and Main Roads has a number of industry liaison groups where we share our challenges with industry and industry with us. And so we try to join up and look for mutual outcomes and mutual sort of ways forward in terms of solutions. We're certainly in TMR mindful of the challenge that's lied ahead. So we've got a record intake of newcomers in various programs that we've got underway at the moment. So our graduate intake was at record levels last year, and will stay at that level again this year. We know that our role often is a bit of a training ground for industry, so we will lose some of those people back out to industry, but we don't see it as a loss. It's really the total capability across the industry and both sectors that at the end of the day results in successful delivery of infrastructure. So for us, we're trying to ratchet that up, and it's not just in the engineering ranks, it's in those professional associate roles, in our technical roles, and in that blue-collar workforce that you mentioned as well, Stephen. So we're trying to tackle it across that spectrum and bring or increase the capability and look for developing skills across our people as well. So we make a large investment through our relationship with the universities and our various assistance programs internally to help our people to develop. And similarly, we work with industry in that area as well in terms of helping develop capability across both industry and government. So I think, there's certainly plenty of challenges ahead, but I see it also as opportunity. Attracting more people into this sector, it's a sector that does great things for the community, and there's plenty of opportunity. So there's that side to look at it. Thank you.
Andrew, your thoughts?
Some good thoughts there, Dennis, and I'd agree with Dennis that certainly TMR and the industry have a very good, close working relationship. I'm involved in a whole range of task forces or working groups with the state on this amongst many other topics. But interesting comments about how do we upskill, how do we get more people, how do we get them right. The government and its contracting parties are looking to do a lot more in the area of traineeships I know in the building sector they're looking at a lot more apprentices. That means also working a lot closer with training colleges and being able to look to upskill those people. There's also many other industries where we have got some skills that could equally transfer into the engineering and construction sector, and it's looking at ways of being able to get those people upskilled so they can then move into the construction sector, particularly in that blue collar area. So before I put up a slide around how many employees we have, or the total labour requirement across the whole building and construction industry in Australia, over a million people. As, say, the residential sector might drop off, how can we move some of those skills across into the civil infrastructure area? How can we transfer their skills and update their skills so they can become viable in that sector and they become multi-sector skilled? So there's some of the areas where there are opportunities to do that. Main Roads have always had a very strong graduate recruitment program. I know a lot of companies in the industry do the same and are looking to do a lot more of that over the next couple of years. QMCA sponsors a thing called Construction Arium, which is a program that's run every probably 2-3 months in the state, and that is around basically giving people across the entire engineering and construction spectrum, particularly those younger people in the area, the skills in terms of they come in, they look at doing a tender for a major structure, they tender it, then they build it, and the one that they've been building of late has been a small version of the Story Bridge. That gives us some really good skills in understanding about the whole spectrum of that construction sort of project life cycle. They're the kind of programs that we need to be looking at, to be doing a lot more of, to upskill our engineers, upskill our tradespeople, upskill those semi-professionals in the industry very, very quickly so that they can be the next SPEs, can be the next PMs coming through.
Thanks, Marion. Question to you. In your research around infrastructure, are you noticing any commensurate activity happening at any government level that's addressing the skills shortage area while they're pushing more projects to market? Are you seeing at least an acknowledgement within government that we may be creating an issue?
One of the things that has come up is not my own research, but my colleague at Grattan has been publishing on skilled migration, and they're having a look at a variety of issues with skilled migration and the way that we go about sort of bringing migrants to this country and how we choose them. And one of the things that's been very interesting, I think, in that work has been that they've focused on the fact that we have these occupational and industry lists, which don't work very well. And so they're looking at the possibility of more of a wage-based approach for bringing in skilled migrants. And I think it is interesting because it's responding, I think, amongst other factors, it's responding to the fact that it's very easy for employers to articulate the skills that they want, but it tends to be quite anecdotal. It's not well backed by data, and some of it is quite transient, or the skills can be fixed in the skills gaps can be addressed by people in a related field, or by more smart use of technology, or also by different firms and governments coordinating their pipelines better. There's quite a lot of different strategies that can be used, but I do think looking at the method of bringing in skilled migrants is potentially a very interesting component of the answer to this conundrum, and it's certainly how historically we have managed a lot of these kinds of challenges that we're facing today.
Okay, thank you for that, Marion. We'll now open more broadly to a Q&A session. Thank you for sending your questions through in the chat. Please continue to do so, and we'll respond to questions as we're able. Dennis, a question from Sean in New South Wales. He has commented that part of the problem contributing to the skills shortage is the lack of or the inconsistency of work outside the boom times. In the past, there was almost a lost generation of engineers due to no available work. Do you have any comments or thoughts on how the infrastructure industry can improve in making it more resilient to handle the highs and lows?
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for the question. Look, I think that's always been a feature of our industry and the sector. So we've always had these ups and downs, and it's, I suppose, the challenge for us in both government and industry is to try and influence the investment decisions there. And to be honest, I think that's been pretty successful. We saw before COVID came along, we already had record levels of investment in infrastructure, and that's really stimulated it more as a partial solution to making sure that the economy was still working and healthy during these difficult times. So I think it's always going to be a challenge. Certainly the conversations that we have regularly with our industry partners talk about this, and it is both us in government in our planning, our forward planning, that play an important role, but also industry and their role in terms of advocating with governments. So I think it's certainly a shared issue. Thanks, Stephen.
Marion, Edmund Hon has asked the question, the trend of recent uprisings of mega projects, does it simply indicate underinvestment of the government, federal and or state, of years before, or something else?
So I have heard people make this argument quite often, and and people often do have the perception that there's been an infrastructure deficit. I think the way I think about this is there's remarkably little shared understanding of what it means to have a long, protracted shortage or deficit, and it's because we don't really have a benchmark as to what is enough infrastructure. What we really care about is not the infrastructure per se, but the services that we get from it. And then you get into this thing about, well, it's not kind of how many roads, how many bridges. It's really what is it like to get around a major city in peak hour? What is it like to get between two major centres? And so that comes down to not only what have you built, but also how well have you maintained it, and how well are you managing demand over the course of the day or the week or the year. So there's plenty of estimates out there, including Engineers Australia actually has got estimates of the size of Australia's infrastructure gap. And they always come up with very big numbers. But I think we don't have a particular benchmark. Even when Infrastructure Australia puts out its infrastructure audit, they don't try to get into this because it's very difficult to answer kind of what's the right amount. So I think, I guess where I think is what we should really be worrying about is those things that I said. What services do we get from the infrastructure? What sort of quality? What sort of reliability? What sort of safety? Rather than sort of thinking, well, I mean, in a sense, I sort of agree with the questioner in that there is a boom and bust cycle to infrastructure investment. But I guess I'm more dubious about the proposition that we've had historical underinvestment. We are getting more investment now, but don't forget, interest rates are at a historically low level. So it's a very cheap time to build. Borrowing money has essentially never been cheaper. So that also influences how much building you get at any given time. And I guess the other thing I would say is don't forget that governments have relied upon engineering construction in the context of COVID. They've stepped up their spending on infrastructure. I'm here in Melbourne and we are in lockdown with curfew.
but construction is still continuing. So there's quite a lot of factors going on, and the way that infrastructure is not just about building things, it is about this sort of macroeconomic contribution as well. So, yeah, in short, I would say perhaps, but it's no one can really give you a great answer to that question.
Andrew, I wonder what the industry's perspective is on that. What are your thoughts?
So, thanks, Stephen. Some interesting comments there, Marion. And look, there was a significant amount of investment 20, 30 odd and further years ago in infrastructure that has lasted a long period of time. A lot of those assets that were invested in, they're starting to come towards the end of their normal sort of life. So we're doing life extension work on them. So it does feel like, yes, there has been an infrastructure gap. Investment gap. And I think there has been an element of that, particularly with population and industry growth in certain areas, and where infrastructure is always something that tends to be in a catch-up cycle. So it does feel like it's behind the eight ball. When we start to get external influences like the Olympics, that will drive further legacy or longer term infrastructure investment that is going to be there for the community and the economy for the next 20 odd years. So yes, it does feel like that there is an infrastructure gap. The quantification of that is always extremely difficult. But I think that is a function of the fact that we've had assets that were built a long period of time ago. They're getting to that renewal or asset enhancement stage again now, and we probably haven't invested as much to keep up with population and economic growth over that period of time.
Genevieve, Katrina Lynch has asked, are employers doing enough to address retention, particularly of women? Many people are leaving contractor roles for consultants in government that offers perhaps more flexibility, parental leave, less hours. Can we get your perspective on that? And then, Andrew, we might flip back to you on that one as well.
Sure. This is definitely a problem for our industry. Katrina's picked up a really good point here. The Australian Institute of Project Management recently just did a survey of young construction professionals, and they found that 25% of those professionals don't see themselves in construction for more than 5 years, which is a scary statistic. And the reasons that they sprouted for that were stress, work-life balance, and culture. The cultural elements just didn't fit with their lifestyle. I personally left construction a little while ago, and I work client-side on construction jobs. However, some of these elements did play a part in why I chose to make that decision. And I feel like as an industry, we need to stop sweeping these under the rug, and we need to start looking at what's changed over the past few decades and why young professionals are making these decisions. For me, some of the things that come to mind are our home lives look very different. For example, I don't go home to a cooked meal. I have to go home, do my groceries, cook my meal myself. My partner also works in construction. So we have very busy lives, and our work-life balance was completely thrown off when we both worked in construction. So I think we need to start supporting our employees in that space more instead of sweeping it under the rug. And I've heard people say that young people just aren't as tough as they used to be. I think as a counter argument to that, young people have very different lives to what young professionals used to have in construction. An example of that is my cell phone that's sitting beside me at the moment, my mobile, it goes off 24/7. So you're never disconnected from work anymore. And I think this is a huge reason as to why young people tend to leave construction. So Andrew mentioned earlier the inclusion of technology. If we can start to work with technology instead of abusing it in terms of being available 24/7, and identify ways that we can support our young professionals so that they can have better work-life balance while they're working in construction, that would be really beneficial.
I agree with what Genevieve's mentioned there, particularly that we need to do better as an industry. There was this view that unless you're working, when I started my career, unless you're doing 50 odd hours a week, that you're not working hard enough, and that you need to pick your act up. I'm hoping that we're seeing the end of that kind of approach. But we need to I made the comment in my presentation that there is technology out there that we need to use better. And by starting to use technology better, we can then keep people in the industry longer. I wholeheartedly agree with Genevieve that we need to do better. There are certain things that we're trying to put in place as industries now to create that better work-life balance and create a better working environment for people who want to stay in it. Now, you may not necessarily want to always be on site. You can be in an engineering role, you can be in an interface role, but we need to create those pathways for people so that they, particularly females, so that they can stay in the profession and so we don't lose them. We've got a massive infrastructure boom ahead of us, and we need to use every resource that we have available.
Thank you both. Dennis, two related questions around skilled migration, one from Paul in Victoria, another from Mohammed in Singapore. What has been the impact of COVID on securing additional resources, such as 457 visas, and what are the current chances for a mid-career, 15-year industry experienced transport engineer from Singapore, who already has Australian permanent residency, but not necessarily in Australian work experience?
Good questions. Look, I think the impact of the visas is insignificant, flowing from the closure of our borders. So normally we get 24,000 people or engineers starting in the general engineering industry each year. And so the proportion that come into that market, it's roughly 9,000 local graduates from Australian universities, 9,000 that come here permanently, and the balance of around 6,000 are on those visas. So that impact isn't insignificant. We haven't had any of that, or very limited amount of that over the last 12 months. So we are going to start to feel that squeeze, there's no doubt about it. And so I know that's been raised with the federal government, and it is a priority when our borders can start to open again, an identified priority that needs to be addressed early. In terms of a 15-year engineer that has great experience and residency here, there's nothing precluding anyone applying for roles in certainly our organisation in terms of where their experience and background comes from. We've got a very culturally diverse workforce. I know one of my team has people from 19 different countries around the world, and so we value that diversity. So I'd encourage the person that's asked that question to keep an eye out for advertisements. Sounds like the skill set that he has to offer is highly relevant to our challenges at the moment. So I wish him all the best. Thank you.
Marion, Steve Verity poses, are you confident the Australian infrastructure plan will go far enough to address the capability and capacity shortcomings that are likely to increase given your findings?
Sorry. Thanks for the question, Steve. It's hard for me to answer that question. I'm not close to the process of coming up with the Australian infrastructure plan, but Infrastructure Australia is consulting widely, and I think people do have a large opportunity to have input to that. I think I would say that the interest of it's obviously a government organisation is producing the plan. They are somewhat at arm's length to government, but it's important to recognise it's a government agency, and so there's a variety of interests: government on the one hand, industry on the other hand, civil society on the other hand. So the short answer is I don't know what will happen, but I think Infrastructure Australia has played a very useful role in highlighting some of the kind of less noted aspects of what's needed. And one that's pertinent to a number of the questions that I've seen coming up on the chat is about kind of whether we can sustain the high levels of spending that we're getting at the moment. And I really applaud the work that Infrastructure Australia has done, highlighting the need for more maintenance and for a more systematic approach to maintenance. They've talked a lot about the maintenance backlog. And if we think about things like the infrastructure shortfall or gap and whether it's going to be affordable to continue spending at the same kind of rate as we're seeing now, then I think highlighting some of those issues that are not front of mind for politicians is a very useful role, and I very much hope that we see more of that kind of thing. I would also say, relevant to some of the other questions on the chat, is IA has been arguing the case since the audit, if not before, about the importance of skills within government, so to be able to do effective contract management. And again, that'll be an interesting thing to look at in the plan to see what they've come up with on that, because it's quite a difficult issue to document, but nevertheless very important to the effectiveness of how these projects run.
Genevieve, perhaps a question to you initially, but others may wish to jump in. Richard Fullerlove's asked, do you agree that with the current skills shortage, a way to meet construction demand is through digital transformation and higher levels of construction site automation?
Yes, I think that's a good idea, and I think that leads to Andrew's point that he was talking about earlier. I feel as though digital technology and automation on site could definitely help us in supporting our people on site to have more of that work-life balance, and that in turn will mean that they stay in the industry for longer because their jobs are not as strenuous on them. I also think it helps make things easier than it used to, and it's also interesting and engaging. So, for example, I remember the first time I saw a drone survey, and that just felt like we were bringing new technology into the construction industry that shook it up a little bit. We don't really have a lot of that day to day, so to actually see that digital change and transformation come into the industry and the way that it can be used to support jobs is really great. I've also experienced the flip side of that, where companies have tried to roll out apps and software systems that actually just make life a little bit more complicated. So I think there's a balance there somewhere, and we can find that balance to support our people. I think that would be really beneficial when it comes to assisting a skills shortage and also opening up a new industry of people into construction. So people with software backgrounds and technology backgrounds that aren't traditionally thought of as engineering, infrastructure or construction professionals can definitely help us here and help to fill that gap.
Andrew, Ian Barron asks, are manufacturing skill shortages impacting construction product supply? Are we getting concerns from elsewhere creating havoc for us?
They are certainly in some areas, Stephen. We're already seeing on a lot of projects steel prices going through the roof. That is a function of the demand out there and also a function of demand and supply, really. But we're also seeing shortages in conduits. They're needed on pretty much every single civil project around, and a bunch of other materials as well. So yes, manufacturing capability or capacity and its ability to produce the things that we need for civil construction, conduits, steel, etc. That is certainly affecting the industry at the moment, and the fact that a lot of that supply is coming from overseas, so it's affected by COVID border issues and the fact that we're not able to get stuff off the wharf as quick into where it's required to be.
Marion, from Helen Fairweather, assuming the increased infrastructure is to support an increase in population, however, with COVID and closed borders, we're now in a second year of decreased population growth. Is this having an impact or likely to have an impact?
This is such an interesting question, and I've been wondering about this myself. Australia's had a lot of population growth by the standards of the rich world over recent times. In fact, some of it has been essentially at the very top. And if you think about the whole portfolio of government, infrastructure construction, a lot of it is driven by population growth. Part of it is driven by the fact that we're getting wealthier, and we like to spend some of our wealth on infrastructure, but part of it is simply population growth. So you hold population growth, and what happens? Well, partly what's also been going on is that money is so cheap, so it's been a good time to build. But I think it would be one thing I have thought would be interesting to see is it's hard to predict the future with COVID, but if you imagine that our borders remain substantially closed or largely closed for quite a sustained period, so call it sort of medium-term period, then our need for infrastructure will be greatly reduced because the population growth will just be natural increase, which is the smaller part of our population growth. And if that happens, then and that's before you bring in the fact that we have, in the process of responding to the pandemic, incurred enormous public debt, and that has yet to really bite, I think, in what governments do about it. But that will happen, and one of the discretionary items is infrastructure. So there's a whole lot of things going on here, but I guess for what it's worth, my speculation is that low population growth will lead to, or has the potential to lead to, a significant curtailing in infrastructure investment, and also partly accelerated by the fact that we're seeing changing patterns of work and travel. And again, I don't know if they'll be sustained longer term, but I think at least in some degree they may well be. So prediction's hard. We are in the thick of this pandemic and we don't really know what's going to happen. But I think that the question puts their finger on this very important issue that is one to watch, because I wouldn't expect that things will just continue as they have in recent years into the medium term.
Jen, Zoe asked the question, do you have any advice for leaders when recruiting?
Yes, I do. I think that leaders should play a very active role in the recruitment process. I know often they are time-poor professionals that in bigger organisations sometimes leave recruitment up to other departments. But I feel like leaders have at their fingertips a very important resource pool, which are their own people, and they can ask those people why they work for the company they work for, what they love about their job, what they wish the job had or could do differently for them, and tapping into those resources and then using that actively to recruit new pools of people is really important. Our leaders, as we know, are very important from a cultural point of view for companies. They're the ones that tend to set the day-to-day culture of the team. So it's very important that they're identifying the right people to join their team as well. So knowing the strengths and weaknesses of the team that you have is really important. And often they're the ones that are closest to the gaps in their own team and what elements of diversity or what new diverse people can bring to their team. So I would encourage all leaders, I know it's fairly time consuming, but if not being directly involved in a panel or setting the advertisement, for example, working closely with your HR or people and culture teams to identify where you may need support in your business and how you can potentially reach out to people to promote your company and promote the team as well.
Thanks, Jen. Perhaps just one last question before we close this out. And there's been a few questions come through around the particular issues that local government's facing. Dennis, from a public sector perspective, I wonder if we might ask your thoughts around what local government can do to best recruit and retain engineers and other infrastructure-focused folk.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question, because I know local government have similar challenges to ourselves, but often are also fairly small in terms of their engineering workforce, depending on the size of the local government. So certainly looking to different models of procurement. I know historically some of the local governments have banded together and looked at how they can partner in terms of attracting and retaining good engineering expertise and services. So that's certainly one strategy. For those that better positioned, I suppose, in terms of the size of their program, one of the things that's worked for us is that entry pathways and really encouraging some diverse thinking around how you meet your skills needs. So look at different types of employees and even different sourcing mechanisms. One of the programs we've done recently in our workforce is taken some of the digitisation work and partnered up with an organisation called Jigsaw, which accesses people with various types of disabilities and engage them to help us with providing a service. And a lot of that can be done remotely. So that's been really successful. So all of those sort of innovative, different types of sourcing strategies come into play. And then I suppose it's grow your own through those other entry pathways programs, make that investment. Certainly form those partnerships with universities like we have, and certainly reach out to us and partner with organisations like Transport and Munros. And I know we've got a very good and enduring partnership with local government here in Queensland, and we've got a component of that focuses on that technical capability. And so we recognise that, and we really value working with our colleagues in local government. Thanks, Stephen.
Unfortunately, that's all that we have time for today. Can you please join me once again in thanking Marion Terrell, Andrew Chapman, Dennis Walsh and Genevieve de Michel for their time and their insights. I would like to thank Engineers Australia industry partner, Queensland University of Technology, for making our webinar possible. We'd appreciate your feedback on the program today to help us improve and plan for future sessions. Please complete a short feedback form, which is linked in the description box below. Thank you once again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next seminar. Thank you.